the natural moral law, contraception and the natural moral law, because curiously enough, the Catholic Church insists that its position on contraception is not a Catholic position. In other words, the Church insists that anybody of right reason, goodwill, anybody who's open-minded and reasonable should be following the teaching that the Catholic Church puts forward. And the Church is convinced that God has placed in all of us an understanding, a basic fundamental understanding of what is morally good, what is morally right, what is wholesome, and what will promote human welfare. And St. Paul even refers to this in his letter to the Romans. It's the classic text on the natural moral law. Do we have any Protestants here? Okay, fine, good, I can take my gloves off. No. But Protestants will tend to discredit the Church's appeal to the natural moral law because of their doctrine of the total depravity of the human person. They say that we're so depraved, there's no way that we can look to the natural order of things and learn anything. Well, the Catholic Church believes in sinfulness and believes that we're fallen, but does believe that God has created the world in such a way that we can look to it and understand his purposes and understand what he has planned actually for us in terms of our own well-being. And so the Protestants will rely just on the book. If it's not in the Bible, they're reluctant to embrace it. And I've never understood why they are uneasy about the teaching on the natural moral law, because the book refers to it. In St. Paul's letter to the Romans, he says, "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature observe the prescriptions of the law, they show that the demands of the law are written on their hearts." So St. Paul was saying, all these poor benighted people that never had the benefit of the Ten Commandments, and what was revealed to Moses on Sinai, nonetheless know that you shouldn't kill and you shouldn't murder and you shouldn't bear false witness. Why? Because it's constitutive of us as human beings. It's written on our very hearts. And so Paul himself refers to that in his letter to the Romans. Now, something else about our approach to morality is that it's a Catholic approach. It's a very positive and open one. My favorite text from St. Thomas Aquinas, a great medieval theologian, with regard to the moral life, is found not in his great Summa Theologica that everybody knows about, but in his great Summa Contra Gentiles. And in the Summa Theologica, however, it's interesting where he does a summary for beginners, that's what he calls it, of Catholic teaching. And if you ever tried to wade through it, it's not for beginners. But when he talks about creation, he talks about the nature of God, he talks about the Trinity, he talks about the Incarnation. But when he gets to the section of the Summa Theologica where he's going to start talking about the moral life, he does not begin with a treatise on the law. That is, the commandments, what God tells us we can or cannot do. The first treatise in the section of the Summa Theologica, the first treatise dealing with the moral life, is on happiness, is on beatitude, because that's the end, that's the goal of the moral life as Catholics believe it to be. And then when we go to the Summa Contra Gentiles, this approach is reinforced when Thomas says, God is offended by us only when we act against. Now, we have a tight schedule today. If I have more time, I ask people to finish the sentence. Invariably, people will say, God is offended by us only when we act against his will, or only when we act against his commandments, or only when we act against his laws. Thomas doesn't say that. He says God is offended by us only when we act against our own good. So if the church puts something out as sinful, something we ought not to do, why ought we not do it? Because it's contrary to our own good, is what the church comes back and says. If we sin, we don't hurt God. We can't hurt him. The only people we hurt are ourselves. if you walked away from here, from anything I have to say, with nothing other than that quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, I'd be thrilled, because that gives you the Catholic approach, the Catholic perspective on the moral life better than anything else I can think of. And in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's also interesting to see, because if we're talking about contraception and the natural moral law, what I want to present here, my goal, is to show that the Church's position on contraception is reasonable. It makes sense. Okay? I mean, that's you will encounter all kinds of people out there that think we're crazy for holding the position on contraception that we do. Usually I sit down with these people and say, look, I don't anticipate that I'm going to be able to change your mind in the next half hour, but I would hope that I can at least show you that the position the Church holds makes sense, is reasonable. Okay? And as Catholics, we believe that everything we hold to within the moral order is reasonable. And we see in this quote from the Catechism, this is remarkable. Again, this is the Catholic approach. Sin is an offense against reason. I mean, that's astonishing if you stop and think about it. Again, you go out and lecture somebody, or have somebody over for a beer and say, let's play finish the sentence. And you say, and you say to them, sin is an offense against, they will say it's an offense against God, it's a sin against his commandments, it's a sin against his laws. Sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. Then God comes into the picture. It is a failure in genuine love for God and neighbor caused, now this is also absolutely astonishing from a Catholic point of view, I think. The culture that we live in is not Catholic. The culture that we live in, if it's religious at all, it's profoundly Protestant. Okay? And our thinking is shaped by that. And the Protestant approach to the moral life is one that's based on the book, on the commandments, on the laws. If God has said it, why do we do it? Because God said it. We have to. God said it, that's why we do it. And we have the problem of total depravity, too. Here in the Catholic approach, it is a failure, sin is a failure in genuine love for God and neighbor caused by a perverse attachment to certain goods. Sin is an attachment to a good. I mean, that's how positive and open the Catholic approach is to the moral life. It even says to sinners, you're trying to do the right thing. You've chosen wrongly. You're after a good, but you're mistaken here. You're not going to reach the good that you hope to by engaging in the action that you're currently engaging in. That's a message we want to get across about contraception. I named today marital chastity and the allure of contraception. There would be no allure to it if people didn't perceive some quality of good there that they were trying to find. Okay, whether it's relieving anxiety, whether it's helping them achieve other goods like educating their kids or preserving the wife's health or whatever. If people are contracepting, it's because they're looking for some kind of good. And the Church says, yeah, we understand that. That's all right. The problem is you don't want to be attached to a certain good in a perverse and disordered way. Okay? John Henry Cardinal Newman, writing in Victorian England, liked to tweak the noses of the dominant Victorian Protestant culture in one of his, G.K. Chesterton. I have another quote from Newman later, but Chesterton made the outrageous statement, as a Catholic apologist, the young man knocking at the brothel door, a brothel is a house of ill repute, where the young man knocking at the brothel door is seeking God. Now that, to the Victorian sensibility, that was unspeakably outrageous. But what was Chesterton trying to point to here? He was trying to point to the Catholic belief that we regard human behavior as being ordered toward a good, and what we have to do is straighten out people's thinking about it. Because the young man knocking at the brothel door isn't intending just to do something nasty, something vicious, something vile, something ugly, something bad. He's looking for comfort. He's looking for some companionship. Maybe he's gone through a very difficult time in his life, and he's looking for some understanding, some warmth, for some human companionship. The problem is, all these good things he's looking for aren't behind that door. That's the problem, you know. It's sex for pay. I mean, the goods he's looking for behind that door aren't there. Even pleasure. There's nothing wrong with seeking pleasure. The Catholic Church says pleasure is a good, if it is sought in a properly ordered way. Okay, in a proper pursuit of goods. Ralph McInerney, a professor at Notre Dame, added to Chesterton's observation and said the young man knocking at the brothel door is seeking God. He's just got the wrong address. You know, I mean, God is down the street in the tabernacle of Our Lady of Lourdes Church. You know, if you're really looking for him, that's where you've got to go. So it's important, as we try to understand the Church's teaching ourselves, and as we try to share it with others, that we realize that those with whom we're trying to share this teaching are looking for what's good, and that's what we want to show them, and how that the embrace of contraception will not help them realize the goods that they're seeking. Now, I'm going to be citing some Catholic documents, but I'm citing them to make the point that Catholic teaching on contraception is not narrowly Catholic, but rather is an expression of insights into human nature and behavior, which is universal, okay, which applies to everybody. So there's a certain irony here in my approach, and that is to insist that it is Catholic teaching that its teaching on marital chastity is not distinctively Catholic. It's a matter of faith for us that the Church's teaching on this ought to be understood by anybody who can reflect on these matters. Now, does somebody have the little postcard with the day's schedule? Yeah. We did start late, and we'll be able to make up time, but I don't want to get entirely off schedule here. But in 1968, Pope Paul VI, issued an encyclical dealing with the regulation of births, and it was like a neutron bomb. I mean, it was just scattered radioactivity everywhere. I mean, people were horrified that Paul VI was coming out and saying that there was something wrong with contraception. And again, the Church was denounced as being benighted. But one of the things that Paul VI insisted upon in that encyclical was that he was articulating a natural moral truth. And in the encyclical, he even said, no member of the faithful could possibly deny that the Church is competent in her magisterium, that is in the bishops and the Pope, to interpret the natural moral law. Okay? We're not talking about divine revelation here. And he went on, Jesus Christ constituted the bishops as the authentic guardians and interpretations of the whole moral law. Not only that is of the law of the gospel, that's what's revealed. The law of the gospel is what was revealed in Jesus Christ that we could not conceivably come to know through the use of our own reason. That is, that he is God, that this carpenter's son is actually God. You reason till the sun burned it out, and you'll never come to that conclusion. You know, we have to be told that. That's revelation. But what we're presenting here today, and that's why we have evidence-based medicine. You know, we have a psychiatrist. We can work from the natural sciences and understand this. So the bishops are guardians and interpreters of the whole moral law, not only that is of the law of the gospel, but also of the natural law. For the natural law, too, declares the will of God, and its faithful observance is necessary for men's eternal salvation. What does that mean? For men's eternal happiness, okay? For achieving the ultimate goals that God wants for all of us, which is happiness in this life and happiness with him forever in the life to come. It's just making the same point. Now, let's turn very briefly to the Bible, again, in terms of articulating the natural moral law. When I grew up and read the Bible and read this passage in Galatians, it read in the following way. Now, the works of the flesh, St. Paul is telling the Galatians, are obvious. Immorality, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, witchcraft. Witchcraft. Any of you remember that translation? You didn't read your Bibles enough as Catholics, that's the problem. But it always struck me odd as a kid that all of a sudden witchcraft crops up in the middle of this list of disorders. Well, the reason is because in the 16th century, you've heard of the King James Bible. King James was preoccupied with witches, as much of 16th century society was. Now, Christians in the 16th century didn't contracept. I mean, they didn't try to avoid having babies. They wanted to have babies. It wasn't an issue that even had to be addressed. When they came to this list of sins and translating from the Greek, came to the Greek word pharmakeia, they knew that that referred to potions and drugs, right? And so they thought, this must mean witch's brew. This must mean sorcerer's potions, right? And so they translated it witchcraft. Now, the scripture scholars, knowing more about the Hellenistic world into which the early Christian church was surfacing, realized that the Greeks and the Romans practiced contraception, and one of the ways they did was to take sterilizing poisons, right? They had some other clever approaches too, like putting camel dung in the vagina after intercourse. It wasn't too effective. You don't even want to know some of the things they tried to practice. But as the Christians emerged into the Hellenistic world, they encountered women taking sterilizing poisons. So that makes a lot more sense. If you look at the list of disorders here, immorality, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sterilizing poisons. That follows on immorality, impurity, and licentiousness. So you can tell your Protestant brothers and sisters that there's actually a Bible verse that addresses this problem. The 1930 was a remarkable year for many, many reasons. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but I'll tell you, we started 15 minutes late. I'm going to conclude my talk at 10:30, and then we'll adjust it back the rest of the day as we go along. In 1930, there was a group of bishops known as the Anglican bishops. You know that you have the Church of England, which broke away from Rome, and the monarch declared himself the head of the Church of England. Okay, insofar as the law of Christ doth allow, he said, but it doesn't. We know it doesn't allow it at all. But anyway, the Archbishop of Canterbury was the figurehead, ecclesiastical head of the Church of England. The Anglican Communion, which are all the churches around the world in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, are a residue of the British Empire. Okay, so as the British Empire spread throughout the world, they took their church with them. And then in this country, we broke away, and the Church of England here became what? Yeah, the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church is the daughter church, the Church of England. So the Archbishop of Canterbury gathers together all the bishops of the Anglican Communion in his palace, which is in Lambeth, and they just look at what's going on in the world, and they try to coordinate their activities and what's going on. And they pass these resolutions. They have no binding power at all because the Archbishop of Canterbury has absolutely no authority. But in 1920, they passed a resolution fiercely condemning the growing practice of contraception, because Margaret Sanger and these names that you're familiar with were beginning to push the eugenics movement and the birth control movement. So they gathered again in 1930. They get together roughly every 10 years. And there had been increased pressure to accept contraception. And so a resolution was introduced to suggest that contraception could be used by couples who were having difficulties in their marriage with regard to the regulation of births. The bishops were hotly divided over this. 50% either abstained from or voted against the resolution, and 50% voted for it. So it was a very tentative approval of the resolution. And they said if a married couple finds that they ought to avoid having a child for a serious reason. The most Christian approach is total abstinence. That's what the Anglican bishop said. If this proves impossible, and they don't say why that proves impossible, there might be temporary recourse to contraception. Well, that just blew the lid off people's attitude with regard to this. The Washington Post editorialized against the Anglican Conference of Bishops and said that they had adopted an immoral posture and that it may lead to a decline in public morality. So the Washington Post editorialized against the Anglican bishops. Something else happened in 1930. King Boris of Bulgaria fell in love with Princess Giovanna of Italy. And, something else happened before I get to that. So, Hermann Knaus and Eugenia Kiyosaka, a German and a Japanese researcher on opposite ends of the globe, discovered in 1930 that a woman ovulates mid-cycle. Now, we didn't know that till 1930, which is remarkable, but I have books upstairs in my library prior to 1930. One is on the psychopathology of sex, in which an English physician refers to a pathological condition that certain women suffer from, known as Mittelschmerz. Mittelschmerz means pain in the middle. Germans are very direct with their language. And physicians were finding that in the 28-day cycle of a woman, there were some women coming in complaining of breast tenderness, complaining of sharp pain in the side, okay, about day 14, right in the middle of the cycle, Mittelschmerz, It's a pathology. They didn't know what caused it. Well, in 1930, they discovered that this is when the egg is released, and this discomfort is caused by the increase of hormones in the woman's body, the follicle-stimulating hormone, and then there's the increase in estrogen, and this has an effect on the woman, the luteinizing hormone. So all of these, and it's not a pathology at all. It's a sign of a woman's healthy reproductive system. Okay, that was 1930. Then, or maybe before, but nonetheless, King Boris fell in love with Princess Giovanna of Italy, and this was really watched closely by the press with as much excitement as Princess Di and Prince Charles in our own day. There was a problem, and that is that the Pope would not allow Princess Giovanna to marry King Boris unless he agreed to raise the children as Catholics. Sound familiar? and King Boris said, I can't raise the kids Catholic. I'm Bulgarian Orthodox. I have to have a successor to the throne, and the successor to the throne in Bulgaria has to be Orthodox. And the Pope said, well, I'm sorry, you can't marry. And so a lot of pressure was brought. And so finally King Boris relented, and he said, okay, I'll raise the kids Catholic. And the Pope bestowed his blessing on the union, and he gave them a wedding present. And the wedding present was an encyclical on chaste marriage called Casti Connubii. That also happened in 1930. I mean, he's going to give them China. It's but it's a beautiful encyclical, absolutely beautiful encyclical. If you've never read it, you really should. But in it, the Pope was pointing out some of the dangers that were arising from the eugenics movement, the birth control movement. And he refers to a certain group of Christians who had dared to depart from received morality. He's talking about the Anglican bishops, but he didn't mention them by name. And he said they have forfeited the right ever again to be a voice of morality. I mean, that was a pretty strong statement. That was in Casti Connubii. But in it, he says, any use, whatever of marriage, in the exercise of which by human effort the act is deprived of its natural power of procreating life, violates the law of God and nature, and those who do such a thing are stained by a grave and mortal flaw. So he was addressing this growing threat to morality that he was seeing in his own day, all the way back in 1930. A real quick aside, when I used to teach at St. Charles, I'd put terms on my exams, and one seminarian looked at Casti Connubii, encyclical by Pius XI in 1930. I just needed short answers. He didn't have a clue. So he wrote down Casti Connubii, a minor character in Star Wars, along with Obi-Wan Kenobi and R2-D2. I gave him full credit. It was so clever. You know. At the time of the Second Vatican Council, the fathers of the council also addressed this in the section of the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, the section that deals with family, marriage and family, and it's a beautiful section if you've not read it. But the council says, a lot of Catholics think that the council didn't say anything about contraception, but that's not true. When it is a question of harmonizing married love with the responsible transmission of life, it is not enough to take only the good intention and the evaluation of motives into account. That is, people want to do the right thing, and if they tell you they're contracepting, they'll tell you all the right reasons they're doing it. And the fathers of the council said that's not enough. You can't just take the good motives into account. Objective criteria must be used, criteria drawn from the nature of the human person and human action, criteria which respect the total meaning of mutual self-giving and human procreation in the context of true love. So let's look at the human person as he and she are, and then we can have an understanding of what we ought to do with regard to the responsible transmission of life, the responsible regulation of births. All this is possible only if the virtue of married chastity is seriously practiced. Okay? Now, I'm going to finish up here by trying to look at this, again, from its reasonableness. You see, the concern of the encyclical that most people say condemned contraception, which it did. But why did it condemn contraception? Humanae vitae is why. Because of its concern with the great good of human life. Okay, that's the good that the Pope wanted to protect when he wrote this encyclical. And he saw the good of human life being threatened in certain ways by the practice of contraception. So this is the great good that Paul VI was hoping to protect. So when we talk about acting in accord with the natural moral law, we're talking about acting in accord with our nature, which means acting reasonably. Now, what constitutes reasonable human behavior? Well, we have to get real fundamental here and say that we recognize human behavior as reasonable if it is a behavior in pursuit of some end, some good, which the person wants to acquire for his or her own benefit. We act for ends, for goals, for purposes. In philosophy, we say that the ends are the principles of human activity. It's the end, the goal, that not only explains what it is we are doing at any given time, it's the end or goal that even makes it possible for us to act. So earlier this morning, I walked through the front door of my house, and somebody could say, "What's Haas doing?" And one answer could be, he's walking through the front door of his house. But would that have answered the question? No. If he says he's leaving to go to Ivy Hall for a day seminar on contraception, then the question would have been answered. Okay? So you have to look to the end to understand what any behavior is. And I wouldn't have walked through the front door of my house in the cold this morning if it weren't for this end, this goal, this purpose. Okay? You see a young woman standing on a street corner in the rain. It's miserable. You go on, you do your thing, you come back. She's still standing there. You say, "What are you doing?" I mean, you know, the animals know to get in out of inclement weather. Are you all right? And she goes, "Well, yeah." And you say, "Well, what are you standing here for?" And she says, "Well, I'm waiting for a bus." Well, all of a sudden, what looked like unreasonable behavior is reasonable behavior because it's end or goal oriented. Okay? You're having coffee with your spouse. You look out the window. You see Mrs. McGillicuddy walking down the street in her slippers and her housecoat. And you say to your spouse, "Oh, dear, there's Mrs. McGillicuddy again. Dear, would you please go out and get her and take her back to her husband?" The poor woman is suffering from Alzheimer's. She's not acting with a goal toward an end, not acting purposefully, and those people we don't treat as normal human beings. So you go out and you take her by the arm and you gently take her back to her husband. Okay, so this is what I mean about reasonable human behavior being ordered toward goods, ends which are perceived as goods. Now, the most fundamental principle of the natural moral law is everybody comes equipped with this. They become born with it. It's part of our equipment Just as our lungs are there to help us breathe, in our brain is a fundamental moral principle that every human being acts in accord with. And if they don't, we lock them up. Okay? And that most fundamental moral principle is do good and avoid evil. Okay? We say in the intellectual order, what we come equipped with, that you can't even argue to, is the principle of non-contradiction. I cannot maintain that this lectern is here and is not here at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. So you can't argue with people who violate the principle of non-contradiction. You can't deal with people who violate the most fundamental moral principle, do good, avoid evil. Because if you say, well, as I say, we lock them up if that's what they try to do. Now, some people confuse the natural moral law with the laws of nature, and there is a difference between the two. The whole cosmos is ordered in accord with certain ends, purposefulness. God has created all things as they are. You can see design in the whole world around you. You plant an acorn, it'll only grow into an oak tree. It won't grow into a magnolia. So there's a purposefulness and order that's built into nature. And we refer to that as the eternal law. We say that the eternal law is the mind of God ordering all things toward their created ends. You can say the same thing without using the word God, because you can see the order that exists within the world. So you can say there's a certain purposefulness of everything in the world. Now, everything is subject to the eternal law. However, human beings are subject to it in a different kind of way because they have consciousness or awareness. My wife loves dogs. We had a boxer, Max, and she wanted more boxers, so she got Maggie as a little pup. And my wife knows and understands. You get a boy and a girl together, and you get more of whatever you're after. So, but the veterinarian said, don't breed her the first time she goes through heat because she'll be too young and it'll be dangerous. So we said, okay, fine. We thought it'd be no big problem. I don't know if any of you have ever lived in a house with a female dog and a male dog when the female dog is in heat and you're going to try to keep them apart. I mean, it was no easy matter. I mean, our oldest daughter tried to keep Maggie up in her bedroom. We tried to keep Max in the basement. But with 8 kids, doors were open, kids were in and out, and the dogs would go off for one another, howling and barking. They could hardly wait to embrace. But we would grab them and take them back to their respective. And then all night long, they would tie them up, and they would bark, and they would yelp, and they would howl, and they would whine all night long. And it was awful. There's still claw marks in the doors from where they tried to get at one another. Now, Max and Maggie were following the eternal law. They were following the laws of nature. God intended for Max and Maggie to get together, to have more little. But anyway, we got to the end. We were feeling pretty good. And I heard this blood-curdling scream as we were sitting down for dinner. And I go running up to the 3rd floor, and Max and Maggie are locked in the marital embrace, right? And so we wound up with 8 puppies, 4 boys and 4 girls, just as our breakdown was at the time. And my wife sold all of the dogs and bought a cello for our daughter, and she still plays it. But that's the law of nature. That's the eternal law. The lower animals doing what God created them to do. St. Thomas, and the tradition tells us that the natural moral law is the rational creature's conscious participation in the eternal law. Well, what does that mean? I mean, that sounds very philosophical. It means that we're animals too, but we're aware of what's going on. I mean, some of you know Justin. I shouldn't tell this, but anyway, I can tell it. He was a lifeguard down at the Jersey Shore, okay? When he was a young man, 17 years old. Now, when he was a lifeguard, 17 years old, at Jersey Shore, and a young woman walked down the beach, beautiful, in a bikini, certain physiological things occurred that he didn't have to reflect on. He didn't think about it. It just happened, like with Max and Maggie, I mean, it just, because God made us that way. Justin's an animal, We're all animals. I'm an animal too. But he's a rational animal. Some of you who really know him may call that into question. But this is really terrible. Usually I tell these stories and he's not around. They don't know it. But The thing is that a human being is aware of these urges in a way in which a dog is not. They understand the end of those urges, that is, the purpose and goal of those urges. They understand that they are ordered toward the generation of life. They understand that they lead ultimately to the precious good of a little child, just like a month-old baby there. That's a good, that's a beautiful, precious good that we want to nurture, we want to nourish, we want to care for, but we can't unless it's in the context of a committed union between the father and the mother. And so a virtuous young man articulates the natural moral law himself and says it would be unreasonable for me to act on these because I'm not in a position to care for her if she becomes a mother and she's a lovely young woman. I'm not in any position to care for a baby. So he refrains from acting, and guess what? You have formulated the moral precept, thou shalt not fornicate. But it's based on a reasonable reflection of the human nature. The ends of marriage are goods, are great goods, friendship and mutual support. A child, okay, that makes sense of what human beings do. Like I said, you can't understand what an act is unless you see its end. If somebody from outer space saw a married couple in the marital bed, under the covers, giving expression of love for one another, may totally be baffled by what they are doing, might even see it as maybe abusive behavior. But guess what? They can understand what was happening there 9 months later, when the end of that act finally surfaces and makes its appearance. So to act reasonably means to be aware of these goods and to act on their behalf and never to act against a good. And this is one of the most fundamental moral principles we have too. We're under no obligation to realize all the goods of which we're capable because there are too many. Okay. But what we must do is never act against a good as though it were an evil. Why? Because that's unreasonable. It's reasonable human behavior to act on behalf of goods, not to act against them. So we don't have to realize all the goods of which we're capable, but we have an obligation never to act against a good as though it were an evil. And I think this is the essence, understood from the natural order, of the problem with contraception. It is an act against a good. Contra, look at the very word itself, contra. It's against. Against what? It's against the procreative good. It's against the child. Contraception always entails, and think about this, an act other than the marital act. Contraception is always an act other than the marital act. And the contraceptive act is directed expressly against the realization of the procreative good that is inherent in the action in which the husband and wife have freely chosen to engage. So it treats a good as though we're an evil by acting against it, whether it's the condom, whether it's a foam, whether it's the diaphragm, whether it's the surgical intervention, whether it's the pill. That act has no other purpose than to suppress a good. And so people over time have come to look upon this precious child as a threat or as an evil and to act against it. Population. Paul Ehrlich, way back in the 60s, wrote the book, The Population Bomb. He referred to human beings as the pollutants of the planet and referred to them as population, okay? When I was growing up in Pennsylvania, it was against the law, and I'm not that old, I'm getting older by the day, but when I grew up in Pennsylvania, it was against the law to sell or distribute contraceptives. It was against the law. Did the Catholic Church impose that law on the state of Pennsylvania? No, because back in the 19th century, people were a little bit better ordered in their understanding of the moral life and saw the threat to the common good that would come from treating a good as though it were an evil. Now, I could walk into a men's room in a gas station and see a vending machine where I could buy condoms and my buddies could buy condoms. What did it say on the machine? Condoms. Prophylactics, which is an intervention to stop the spread of disease. Condoms, prophylactics, sold for the prevention of disease only. Said that right on the machines. Why? Because it was against the law to sell them to stop babies. Okay, it could be sold to inhibit the spread of a venereal disease, but it could not be sold to stop having babies because guess what? Babies are not a disease. Babies are not a threat. And there was a meeting of physicians, Planned Parenthood physicians, put on by the Center for Disease Control dealing with venereal diseases among teenagers. And a man from the CDC stood up and said, there's a great scourge of venereal disease among teenagers. The most prevalent is gonorrhea. Today it's chlamydia, then it was gonorrhea. He said the second most prevalent form of venereal disease is unwanted pregnancies, and the most effective way of dealing with it is through abortion. So there you had a man of science referring to a child as a venereal disease. This is what happens when we come to perceive what ought to be a good as an evil and then act against it. And I'll conclude. I have 2 more slides to finish up here. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, already saw this, the disorder of this kind of thinking. Again, people aren't meaning to do something that's wrong, but he said, the licentious cruelty of the marital couple, or their cruel licentiousness, pretty strong words, sometimes goes to such lengths as to procure sterilizing poisons, and if these are unavailing, in some way to stifle within the womb and eject the fetus that has been conceived. They want their offspring to die before it comes to life, or if it is already living in the womb, to perish before it's born. He makes a distinction between contraception and abortion, but he also links them by saying if we look at something as a threat and act against it as though it were an evil, and it raises its head, what is the apparent reasonable course of action? To act against it, okay, to get rid of it, to eliminate it. And this is where the great difficulty has been. The thing with natural family planning or periodic abstinence is that it doesn't require positing any act against the procreative good. You simply don't act at all. If a married couple is going through a period in their life where they shouldn't have another child, they can avoid having that other child in ways other than by acting against the procreative good which is inherent within the act that they freely choose to engage in. Because if they did that, that's unreasonable. You're treating a good as though we're an evil. They just simply avoid acting altogether, and they can do that because we're going to find today of the many signs of fertility that can direct them to allow them to act reasonably. We can react to given situations in 2 ways. One can be moral and the other can be immoral. I'm pursuing goods. I'm trying to get ready for today. My son, well, let's say I'm giving a conference summertime. This won't work in this weather. But he comes in and he says, hey, Dad, can we go shoot baskets? And I can say, that would be a good thing. That would be an act of friendship with my son, but I'm preparing a paper. I can't do both those goods at the same time. So I say to my son, I'm sorry, I just don't have time now, Stephen. Next weekend I'll be free, we'll shoot baskets then. Okay, so you put off the good of, that particular expression of good of friendship with your son until the next weekend. Or he could come in and he could say, hey, Dad, can we go shoot baskets? And I could say, darn it, you broke my train of thought. Would you get out of here? You're always interrupting me. Get out of my office. Well, the end result in both cases were the same. I didn't shoot baskets with my son. But in the second case that I just gave you, I acted against friendship with my son by treating him as though he were bad, and I wanted him out of my presence. And I hope we're able to lay out for you today, drawing on medicine, on psychiatry, on sociology, and with practitioners and teachers themselves, how all the goods that God offers us in our sexuality and marriage can be realized by a reasonable approach to the regulation of births. Okay, and our